Hey all, wow, a great day and just what a great event. I've been able to participate almost all the time throughout the day and listened into several sessions who were fantastic. And I've just seen a ton of interaction and just a great vibe in the chat. So thanks to all the speakers and of course to all of you for participating in on Discord and in the chat rooms and so on and so forth. So I promised towards the end of the opening keynote, or maybe threatened is the right term, that I was going to come back for a special announcement. And I always haven't done a great job at keeping it a secret. Many of you have conversations about it already on in the chat or on Discord, and have tweeted about it and so on and so forth. So the genie is definitely out of the bottle already. But earlier today, a few hours ago, we announced a $325 million investment round, which is the largest funding event in the history of the database market. And it's led by Eurazeo with other investors participating like GV, Google Ventures. And so I just wanted to take some time here before I hand it off to Jim for the real closing keynote, just to give some perspective on that and talk a little bit about what I think this means for you as a Neo4j user, for our broader community, and for our company. I have to start though with just saying just a huge thank you, right? We got here together. We could never have raised this money. We've never have made this investment happen without all of you here on this call, the broader Neo4j community. And you've done some absolutely amazing things over the course of the history of this company and this category. You've downloaded Neo4j over 100 million times. You've written more than a dozen books about Neo4j or graphs. You've gathered in anywhere in groups of 2 all the way up to tens of thousands, like this event here today. You've graphed Belgian beers, Game of Thrones, human trafficking rings, Russian Twitter trolls. You've helped accelerate COVID research through graphs, the Panama Papers, and just so much more. You've really embraced our open source projects and helped make them better, right? And not just the Neo4j database, which of course I tend to think about, kind of first and foremost, right? But it's a very important part of a broader platform, a broader suite of tools, right? And you've helped improve things like the Open Cipher language. That has really paved a path to a new language standard, the first one in 40 years in database query languages, GQual, right? And you invested and helped us growing graph algorithms. So it really planted the seed for what has become ultimately a really thriving community around graph data science. You all made this investment happen, and we're eternally grateful for that. So I wanted to make sure we start with that part. And as I mentioned in the earlier keynote, we've created this category together, right? And the world now knows that graphs aren't a feature, graphs aren't an API, graphs are a category. And I told you that our strategy was always to create this category and help grow it by being just a good steward of the category. And thanks to this community here on this call, and at this conference, we're not just the leader of the category, we're extending our lead. We're growing faster than the other graph databases, according to DB Engines. So therefore, I believe this is really great news for you, this investment. If you're a skilled developer or a data scientist using Neo4j, you're now recognized as part of a global movement. And this investment, it's going to accelerate market demand for graph applications for sure. And that's going to drive more demand for your skills. So just before the pandemic, Upwork published their top 20 fastest growing skills index. And Neo4j was number 11 on that list, ahead of things like Salesforce Lightning and Microsoft Azure. Your skills are going to be needed by companies of all sizes, across all industries and verticals, and everywhere, all countries around the globe. And I can tell you for sure, and I want you to hear it from me as the CEO of the company, we're going to be here for you and with you for a long time. We had a very healthy business before this investment, and this investment makes us go even further and even faster. I think it's also fair to say that the market value of your skills, that has literally increased since this event started earlier today, leading between then and now, basically between the opening keynote and now, thanks to this news. And now, maybe you should go back to your boss tomorrow and demand a pay raise and then blame me for it. So don't do that, please. But more Neo4j project means more demand for your Neo4j skills, right? So the time that you've spent today learning about various parts of the Neo4j platform, those skills are only growing in value. So this begs the question, largest round in database history, what are we going to do with the money? And so I'm thinking about three things. First of all, we're going to build an amazing new headquarters. Second of all, we're going to sponsor a Formula One. And third, a massive feature-length Super Bowl commercial. No, we're not going to do any of those things, obviously. But it does come down to three things: product, product, and product. And that's what it's all about for me. We are a product company, we're a technology company, we're a product-first company. And I'm so excited to pour as much as humanly possible of this investment into our products to give you more features, to give you a better experience, a lower friction access to those features, more cloud services, more integrations and toolings, and more innovation inside the platform and on top of it. And this, by the way, also makes your skills more valuable because you're going to be able to do even more amazing things with Neo4j. And it also creates more opportunity for our partners and our ecosystem. So expect to see even more interoperability and more extensibility and more complementary solutions thanks to this investment. So begs the question, where do we go from here, right? What happens with the largest investment in the history of databases? Well, now that we've created the category, right, which we did together, and then secondly, establish clear leadership in the category, check on both of those things. Now, as I think about this, it's time to go change the database landscape forever. We have the products, we have the community, and we have the company to do that, boosted by this investment. And as I'm sitting here back at my house compared to earlier this morning in the studio, after a day like this, a conference like this, I just think back on what we've collectively accomplished in the last decade. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the 20 independent projects, just the ones that I personally know of that are using Neo4j to find the cure for cancer. Neo4j helping get humanity to Mars 2 years earlier, accelerating diabetes research, COVID contact tracing. You go down the list. And I think about that, and then I think about the momentum that we have today, the tailwind, the enthusiasm in the conference today. And I just can't wait what we all are going to be able to accomplish together in this decade. So thanks everyone for paying attention to this special announcement, but even more thanks for participating in the conference, and even more, thank you for being an active member of this community. So that's all I had for today and for the conference. So thanks everyone, and over to Jim for the real closing keynote. Jim, over to you.
Wow. Thank you, Emil. Now, you normally steal my thunder with your opening keynote, Nodes or Graph Connect, and now you're stealing my thunder in the closing keynote as well. All kidding aside, this is incredible news for the Neo4j community. I think the investment that's coming into the community now means that we're going to be bigger, we're going to be better, and we're going to be just as nice as we are before. I do have one small question before we continue with my presentation, which, will you start paying me now? That'd be really great. Just kidding, just kidding. Anyway, Sometimes I do really technical things at Nodes and Graph Connect, and I talk about all sorts of down in the weeds computer science, which entertains me a great deal since it's part of my day job. But actually, this year I wanted to change that up a little, and I want to showcase some community folks and some Neo4j customers that have been on my radar over the last year since Nodes 2020. Now, the hardest thing about this was actually choosing. There's such a lot of good stuff going on out there in the Neo4j community and on the Neo4j customer side as well. So I've tried to draw upon a good range of people and topics and show how the community is really quite a lovely, friendly, nurturing venue for sharing ideas and experience. To that end, my first guest is Julie Fisher. So after all that excitement, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Julie Fisher as my first guest in this closing keynotes of Nodes 2021. Now, Julie, you're no stranger to Nodes. You were here at Nodes 2020, and in fact, our photographs were next to each other on the Nodes 2020 webpage, which was reflected glory for me. But what we learned last year is that you're working at Asurion and you're working in risk. And that all seems very terrifying to me. So tell us about that terrifying, anxiety-inducing risk thing that you're doing.
I'm not sure I would call it terrifying. One of my coworkers says, we work in cell phone insurance. It's not a fire, right? And so it is very interesting because you are protecting people and their policies and everything like that. And so you definitely want to do a good job, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, like, if something breaks, nobody's going to die, right? So there is... the risk analyst, we look for a lot of fraud, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to perpetuate fraud. And one of the things that I've been exploring is how do you use graph technology and network theory in order to identify that kind of risk and stop bad actors from, getting financial benefits from other people.
Very cool. So in the old days, I used to have this idea that you could kind of see rings in fraud, but I'm guessing that's a very basic view of things, right? And your view seems to be a lot more sophisticated. So what kind of network or graph theory things do you apply to kind of figure out these bad actors?
Well, most of what I have been doing is getting graph visualization up. So we have a lot of adjusters that go through. We've got a lot of legacy systems in place that are more like hard-coded manual rules. And so that has worked really well for us in the past. And we send all of the high risk claims over to be looked at by individual people. And so one of the things that I was doing was not only did I need to look at it, but they benefited greatly from the pilot program that we ran on how do we visualize these kind of things for them. And so we did find one nice big ring, and it did literally look like a ring. I think it's in last year's talk, the visual of it, but it was this nice big ring. But the nice thing about having the adjusters go through line by line is they also identified other kinds of fraud that hadn't occurred to me and that we can also use graphs for. So one of those things is like they will claim a phone, never return the broken phone, which isn't really broken. They'll sign the old phone up under a new account, and they'll just keep doing that and opening multiple accounts under the new device that they get and the old devices that they get to keep. And so you can see these long lines of shipped device and old device connecting from account to account. And so that was interesting as well.
Oh, that's very cheeky, isn't it? So in that case, then you've got effectively some agents learning patterns which are fraudulent in your graph. And at the moment, you've got human experts acting as those agents. Is there a possibility that those human agents could be augmented with software agents? I'm thinking about kind of learned machine learning agents in that case.
Yeah, and that's one of the directions that we're going. So last year was a lot about like, how do we actually visualize these things? How do we make it so that we can see the patterns and what we're trying to find? And this year I've been working on how do we model the graph so that I can programmatically find these kinds of things and new patterns and trends so that we can then send those over as high-risk claims and expand the amount of known fraud that we have, right? Because in fraud, you've got known fraud, and unknown at all. So there's probably good actors, there's definitely bad actors, and then there's everything in between where you're just not sure. So if we can expand the known bad actors into that unsure category, that would be a big win for me.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredible kind of classification problem, right? I think in my mind, that's something that graphs and human intelligence and software intelligence could probably help a lot with. So in there, I mean, you said a lot about graphs. You've got these fraud rings, you've got these kind of fraud chains and so on. And of course, I think to me and you and many people in our community, that seems very natural, or at least after a few years of doing graphs, it seems very natural. But I can imagine, like, you know, if you're similar to me, when you first came to graph, there's kind of a little bit of a learning curve, right? And how did you come to Neo4j or graphs originally? How did you reach that realization that graphs would be helpful to you?
Well, you know what? So I actually was looking at tabular data. So it was in tables, and I would see these patterns, like they would use the same email on 5 claims, and then they would have a different phone number on all 5 of those claims. So you couldn't say they had the same email and the same phone number, but if you looked at those phone numbers, you could find another 5 per phone number, right? And so from that, like, so I was seeing these like chains of things, and I was like, man, if I could put this in some kind of like LinkedIn something, or, you know, something like that they do with the social media, I was like, I bet I could find a lot of fraud. And so we had Neo4j because somebody else apparently had that same idea. And so I was like, Neo4j is where I want to be. And so I essentially like pushed my way into that area so that we could continue to find fraud using the graph technology.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I've struggled with that myself. When I look at, you know, rows of data, I don't think I've got the right brain to kind of see through the matrix, but you could see through the matrix, right? You could see the connections. And
well, and I bet you come from like a computer engineering background, right? Yes. Yeah, so I was an English major. So
no way.
Yes. And so when you come from like that computer science engineering background, you're very used to relational databases, right? Whereas coming from being an English major and like writing creative stories during my, you know, bachelor years, you kind of look at things a little differently, and you're not as constrained by those things that you're so used to from when you were getting your bachelor's degree.
Oh, that is wonderful. You know, I think one of the nice things about our community is that we do have those axes of diversity in it. I think, sure, people like me, the computer scientists, we're well represented, but there are people from across so many disciplines that graphs are helping, and people that are contributing back into graphs from so many disciplines. In fact, a good friend of mine did his PhD in English, in fact, in Elizabethan prose fiction. And the contributions he's made to the graph community are themselves just astonishing. So
I was going to say, has he been using like natural language processing combined with graph? Because that looks like a very fascinating area.
Absolutely. I see folks working on that even now. It's such in the APOC world of Neo4j, in the Hume world, in the kind of vendor product world, it's definitely going there. So this is fascinating because it leads me to something that I'm with a community mindset very interested in. You came from an English background through the insurance world into Neo4j, and like that's an unusual path to take, if I can use that pun. What would you say to previous you who was like looking at this problem, and how would you influence previous you to say, hey, go this way, it's going to make your world better?
Man, that's a really good question. I'm not sure how I would answer that, because kind of the circuitous path that I took led to being able to do all of the things that I do, right? So when I was in college, there was no data science. There was no, like, machine learning was very technical, and I wasn't that interested in math. I mean, English major, not that interested in math. I wasn't interested in, I don't write computer code for computer code. I write it because of the interesting things that I can do with it. And so it wasn't until you get that commingling of analytics, computer science, and math that my interest really comes in. And so I don't know that I could have gotten involved much earlier than I did, just because of where my interests lie and how I think, right? Because the graph databases, those are still pretty new. How old is Neo4j now?
Well, accounts vary, but commonly we say it's about 10 years old, but the truth of it is Emil's older than he looks, and this has been around in one form or another since about 2003. I'm hoping he's already gone home by this point and isn't going to fire me for saying this.
Yeah, so I mean, that's still pretty recent, and Neo4j I know has matured as it's grown. And you guys are one of the forefront graph databases out there. And so it's hard to say I could have gotten involved a whole lot earlier. It would have, of course, be nice to know more computer science, but at the same time, if I'd come from that background, it would have been harder to get into graph. So I don't know what kind of advice I could give a past me other than keep your options open.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the advice to past you is patience because you're going to get really
Yeah.
stuck into this community.
Yes. Yes.
That's awesome. So let me round off by asking you a more open-ended question. So we've seen the stuff that you've worked on. Folks, do check out Julie's talk from last year's nodes if you haven't. It's absolutely wonderful. But where do you think that the GraphTech's going in say Asurion or in Risk or in fact in general, if you can opine so broadly?
I feel like it's going the same way that a lot of data science is growing. It's growing, it's becoming more mature, it's being used on more problems. With graph, especially, I would like to see it applied more to even problems like traffic, right? And so traffic feels like one of those natural things because how much traffic can actually go on a single road between and your intersections or nodes, and so that feels like it could help with those. I just see it expanding into different industries, different domains, and helping wherever it goes because graphs are everywhere and everything is connected, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, really, when you can take advantage of that, and I think the dissemination of information about graphs is one of the really important things because, like you said, it's a different way of looking at things that a lot of people just do not intuitively understand. And so the dissemination of that information is going to be huge in the expansion of graphs into all of those different places and actually being able to use that information, right? So
I think so. I think you're absolutely on the money there, Julie. That's I think and hope that you're right.
Me too.
Well, look, I just have to say thank you so much for joining us at Nodes today. It's been wonderful to host you, even for this very briefest of chats.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Around the community, and I thank you for your time.
Thanks.
So I'm thrilled to announce my second guest for today's closing keynote, Matt Cloyd. You have been in the Neo4j community for a long time now. In the preamble that we had before the closing keynote, we were reminiscing about folks that we have in common in this community. But I think what I'd like to start with, you work on kind of the overlay of civic tech and graphs. Could you tell us a bit about what that means?
Sure. So civic technology, the way that I think about it is using the right size dose of technology to help usually, local communities deal with some kind of issue. I really got my start in Code for Boston. And so it was just a small group of people at first, maybe, 5 or 10 people. But we ended up growing to, sometimes 50 people in a meeting, community of hundreds of people who were all interested in using either technology skills or technology adjacent skills like design, systems thinking, research, et cetera, to actually partner with the towns in and around Boston and work with government officials to, I think at the core of it, improve the relationship between government and constituent to sort of increase people's trust in government by helping government be better public servants and really worthy of that trust. So it's really all about relationship building. And actually, the timing for this interview is great because this week I started a position as a consulting engineer with 18F, which is one of the US federal kind of digital agencies.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. So, sorry to be interrupting you in your first week.
Oh no, this is a good little break in all the orientation training. Yeah, and so graphs have come in for me. So one of the most influential books that I've ever read is this really massive textbook called Design for Ecological Democracy. And it covers kind of the intersection between environmental sustainability, interpersonal equity, and democracy as a whole. And one of the really powerful concepts in there for me was the idea of power mapping, specifically looking at a particular issue in a community and saying, okay, well, who has the power to change this, and who is connected to them, and who can I talk to in order to maybe make some kind of meaningful change here. So that was definitely one of my inspirations in kind of getting into graphs to begin with.
That's an interesting observation, right? That notion of how do I connect to power, and what influence can I exert down that path in order to change things, hopefully for the better. So, I mean, it's obvious to me now that that's a graph problem. Was it obvious to you and your team of civic-minded techs and tech adjacents that it was a graph problem?
I don't know that was immediately obvious. I think it was only when I stumbled upon graph databases and other graph-related concepts in my, casual computing education, that the two of those really, clicked together.
Interesting. So good fortune brought you this way. Then that's good to know. I think we could all do with a dose of good fortune. But then, so it sort of starts to make sense to me a little bit now, because you said you were working with tech folks. I think tech folks are quite comfortable with graph tech nowadays. It's certainly far more humane than when I first started. And even Neo4j was this like Java plus Maven hellscape in its like 0.x versions. And I think actually nowadays it's very humane, and Cypher is very humane and productive for those of us with a modestly technical background. But you've gone a step further, right, with a language called Aspen, which is specifically designed to be even more humane. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So Aspen at its core is sort of designed to be the markdown of creating graph data. It's not a query language, and even though Cypher is a little clunky if you're trying to generate graph data, it is an incredibly elegant query language. So Aspen isn't trying to query, it's just trying to generate the graph data. And this came out of a course that I took in the fall of 2019. So after working in civic tech for a while, I decided to get a master's in conflict resolution because I was interested in getting a little bit deeper into community decision making and how to resolve conflicts and make decisions in ways that promote equity and peace. And in my first class, the kind of conflict theory overview class, one day we had an activity to go on the whiteboard and just model all of the factors and parties in a conflict. And as we started whiteboarding, I went, oh, that looks like a graph. I'm going to see, as somebody else is scribing on the whiteboard, I'm going to see on my laptop if I can just pop this into Neo4j. And then wouldn't that be interesting to have a computable, analyzable graph of the conflict? And I wonder if there are things that we could do with, network analysis and other things there. So I start typing and I start writing the cipher, directly into the browser console. And I'm finding that I have to do very specific things with kind of making sure the entities exist and having everything in the right order and remembering what all the nicknames are. And I started to get a little bit frustrated. And so I started sketching a language, what would it look like to just be able to take notes about a conflict? Like, let's say I was a researcher in a conflict zone, and I just wanted to understand, how this person's related to that person, and how this person's related to that community leader, kind of that power mapping thing, but from a slightly different angle. So I started writing the code that I wished to write, and then found a few amazing blog posts on how to write a simple language. I'm not a language person. Like, I write Ruby-based web applications. I don't write languages. And so this just ended up being a really simple language right now, entirely written in Ruby, that takes, very simple notes about relationships. And then you just add parentheses to entities or nodes, square brackets to the edges or relationships, and Aspen will turn that into Cypher and pop it into Neo4j on your behalf.
Oh, that's wonderful. In fact, as you were telling that tale, like so many similar stories. I was hooked by the Easley and Kleinberg book, Networks, Crowds and Markets. And in one of the chapters there, they actually have the starting point for World War I as a graph, and they show how it evolved from the Three Emperors League, creating triangles of friendships and enemies. And they said, hey, look, and it evolves into World War I. And that blows me away, right, that graphs can do that. It strikes me also, given the modern times and, the ongoing culture war, which is a peculiar kind of conflict, that things like Aspen, in fact, Aspen in particular, could be helpful for, I guess, your neighbor if you're in the Northeast, Sophie Hill, who's a political scientist at Harvard. She runs a system called My Little Crony, which is a delightful pun. And I think something like Aspen would be the kind of thing that a political scientist could use to start to make sense of, well, who's voting for who's taking a backhander for whom, who gets a contract once they're elected, and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a phenomenal way of opening up graph tech to people who are specialists in other areas, right? So, as you say, it's the kind of thing that I could write in a Moleskine book and then miraculously get a graph from it. That's astounding. I love it. So you had this thing when you were relatively new to graph that, effectively when you were trying to follow people and type cipher, you ended up inventing a new DSL for graphs. That's pretty ambitious. Is there anything from your experience that you would say to people, like your previous self, relatively new to graphs, have an inkling of what they can do and want to be involved? I mean, what would your letter to previous you be to help you get going?
So I think it was really just like getting a warm welcome into the community really was a big start. It was, that and reading a couple books on graph theory were really how I got started. And yeah, I don't even clearly remember how I got involved in the community. I feel like somebody from the community itself, I want to say Michael Hunger, emailed me about something randomly one day. Yeah, and I didn't know who this was, but he just provided this warm welcome and then got me connected with a few other people. And I really want to express my gratitude for until recently, the former community manager, Karine. She was just so welcoming and engaging, and I assume that she was like this for everybody who attended Nodes last year, but just was come on in, share what you've got to share, be part of this. So I guess my advice would really just be jump into the community, meet people, through whatever means. People tend to be really genuinely friendly and helpful.
Yeah, I found that, right. I think, a lot of things in Neo4j's business, we always want them to kind of change, right? Particularly, we often want them to grow, right? Community size even, we'd like that to grow. But I think one thing that's been remarkably constant in the community, even as it has grown enormously, everyone's still really nice, right?
Yeah.
I think it's one of the nicest tech communities I've ever been in. There's not the kind of argumentativeness that seems to permeate a lot of communities. It's very helpful. And me too, actually, whenever I want to know answers to stuff that's not apparent to me, drop into the community. There's always someone that will help me, which I should perhaps be embarrassed about, but I'm not. I love it. The community is ace. So given you've got the community at your back, they've got your back, so to speak, I hope you're going to do more stuff with graphs. Where do you think graphs are going to go in your part of the world, in civic tech and so on?
So I don't know if I can, predict anything generally speaking, but one project that I have on the horizon is as part of, I'm finishing up my master's degree in conflict resolution this summer, and I'm doing work with a group through the Center for Peace, Democracy and Development at UMass Boston to is essentially develop what we believe is the country's first early warning and early response system for political related violence. So kind of looking at all of the events in the US over the last year and drawing on the expertise of people who have done conflict forecasting and prevention work in other countries around the world. We're looking at using graphs as one of several different models for basically pulling in data and trying to forecast and helpfully intervene in possible political conflicts. Wow. So right now we're at the very, very early stages, we're just getting formed, just starting out. We haven't yet used graphs for analysis, but we are doing what I think is really interesting, kind of almost philosophical work. Because we want to be analyzing data at the city or the metropolitan statistical area level. And that is more granular analysis than we have found in our literature review so far. Nobody that we have seen, there might be people out there, but we haven't seen anybody doing this. And so we're looking at things like, the interactions and the chains of events that are happening in, say, Portland, Oregon, protest night after night after night after night. Who are the actors there? How are they interacting? What is the quality of their interactions? is that escalating or de-escalating larger conflicts? And so we're having to do a lot of thought around, how do we model things like this in a graph database for analysis? And we don't have any of the answers to that yet, but it's really interesting conceptual work. And I think, 6 to 12 months from now, my hope is that we're going to have a graph-based analysis that, possibly helps forecast, maybe not perfectly, but helps forecast conflictual events that, can be intervened in and de-escalated before it turns into violence.
Wow, that is an incredibly useful piece of kit. Look, Matt, thank you for joining us today. It's been wonderful to host you virtually. I hope our paths will cross physically again in the future. Thank you so much for taking time out of your MS thesis, your new job, and an enormous analysis project. So I triply appreciate it. Good luck for the future, and thanks once again.
Thank you so much.
So on to my next guest. I'm very pleased to welcome Matthias Sieber to Nodes 2021. Now, Matthias, you're a senior technical person. You're a lead software engineer at Citizentric, right? And I know you've been around the Neo4j community for, forever. I know this because I made the error of thinking you were still at a previous job from years ago. So, you've been around since the community since 2015, something like that?
2015 in a professional capacity, that is correct.
And earlier in a other capacity?
Yes. I don't know if you want to go into that right now, but down memory lane. So 2014 is when I got my start in Neo4j. At the time, I was teaching at a coding bootcamp. And one of my students wanted to build a music recommendation service, and the databases that were part of the curriculum were not really suitable for that. So that's when I found Neo4j.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I think that's a pretty interesting thing that you've taught Neo4j. So I think that's something that I'd like to pull apart a bit later on. But coming back to the present, you're at Citizentric. What does Citizentric do, and what are you doing there?
Yeah, Citizentric, that's my take on it. We make the world a better place. Of course, something that all startups aspire to do, but we work a little bit different. We work with a lot of NGOs, but also government organizations, nonprofits. And currently, I'm working on a very exciting project, essentially trying to end homelessness. Right now, the scope is homelessness within Los Angeles County. But the plans are already in place to roll that out to further areas. And that's what I'm working on as a lead.
So hang on. I have a large capacity for believing that problems are graph problems, right? Sort of implicitly as someone that works at a graph company. But how is homelessness a graph?
Well, actually very interesting. That was part of my first job interview, and I drew a lot of comparisons from my previous work at MediaHound, where I built on the already existing recommendation engine to facilitate then cross-media recommendations. And so the goal is essentially to bring people into suitable housing, right? So more specifically right now, we are looking, there's a lot of shared housing. There is more money allocated to housing in general within Los Angeles County. There are many service providers that try actively and do outreach and approach people that are experiencing housing insecurities. And these folks then have the task of doing a lot of paperwork. It's very manual approach. It is not that great. And the downside really is that often the experience is actually so bad for the participants of these programs, the people trying to seek a permanent place, that they often end up on the street again. So there's many factors. It is because it's not only in shared housing, it's not only the home itself, but also who are your other housemates, right? Your roommates in a sense. And so essentially, it is a graph problem. We, of course, ask a lot of data to then get good recommendations out of this.
That's fascinating. So now you explain it, and I feel slightly less stupid. So, but it feels to me like there's two graphs in there, right? There's the kind of recommendation graph, which I think many of us are very comfortable with. We've seen quite a few examples of that. You've built one. I think when we wrote the O'Reilly book years back, we had a small recommendation example in there. But it also feels like you've kind of got a market matching graph in there, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think those folks in fintech or the financial services companies would recognize as a very graphic problem as well, trying to find effectively party and counterparty for, in this case, a house share or something, but similar pattern even if you were in the financial sector, right? So that's nice that I see patterns being used over there in the kind of for-profit sector that can also benefit the kind of non-profit sector as well and help kind of regular human beings get their lives back on track. That's rather lovely. I feel very happy. There's a theme developing here, isn't there? With Matt a moment ago talking about the civic tech, and effectively you're also, for want of a better phrase, in civic tech. Mm-hmm. So it seems there's a definite graph movement there. So a moment ago, before I kind of strayed off. And started demanding to know your graph models and how you do all the recommendations and matching and so on. You mentioned that you've taught Neo4j. Now, I think that's something that we have in common in the early days of Neo4j. All of the Neo4j staff were coders, teachers, coffee makers. We did everything. And I confess I enjoyed the teaching. But when you were teaching Neo4j, I guess you were meeting people that were often pretty early by default in their graph journey. What advice did you give them? And what advice would you give people now in our community who are also kind of at the same point in their journey? I'd be interested to see if that's changed over the years. I suspect it might have because graphs got better, but what do you think?
Yeah, just to clarify, so the teaching that I did on Neo4j and that I still do is very informal, right? So I mentioned the coding bootcamp. So I had discussions with my colleagues and they really loved Neo4j. And, but the thing about, especially that particular book, Coding Bootcamp, sometimes it is not too much about learning. It is about job placement, right? Which is understandable. The participants of those programs, they want to improve their lives by first and foremost, get a better job, right? Secure higher income, of that nature. But once in a while, you have more entrepreneurial minded students in there that just want to do their own thing. And something like Neo4j is great for them because they don't really have to jump through hoops to learn something that is very abstract and hard to grasp. So when I discovered graph databases, I really had a tough time calling, Postgres and MySQL and all those types of relational databases. Because
I'm absolutely gutted that they got the name first, because it feels like graphs are so much more about relationships than they are, right?
Absolutely, they are. So a bunch of tables and spreadsheets. They still have the use. I still use them in very small capacity, and we can talk about that later. They have the use case, but so my teaching, I think the documentation obviously got a lot better over the years. Also the extra content that people put out, training programs, extra content, people like Ryan Boyd, Kevin Van Gandhi in the past, right? Kevin Van Gandhi actually made me feel like a dinosaur when I met him at the training in Los Angeles. And he introduced me to people. I just walked up to him and he introduced me. It was like, oh, this is Matthias. He's been longer in the space than I am. I was like, oh yeah, I've been around for a while. But then, those pieces are great. And then of course, still like Michael Hunger and William Leon, their content is great. I think particularly William's YouTube series probably brought a new cohort of people is, in a sense, to the graph. And that's great. I always tell my junior developers that I work with and introduce Neo4j to please use the official documentation, because it is good. They're a little younger, so they're actually more drawn to videos and tutorials. But in a technology that moves quite fast, between Neo 2 and Neo 4, there's quite a bit of changes when it comes to extra utility. And yeah, Cypher still mostly works the same, but you can of course make use of APOC and all of that stuff. But I'm very much of the mind of teaching by doing, or have a purpose, and go from there. So I have not yet formalized a training program, but I think also the certification definitely helps, right? The certification program helps, and there's a lot of resources available. Now there's even a Discord server. So opportunities out there. And what helped me often is exploring a technology through the documentation, and then here and then there might be something in the documentation that I find odd, but so I try to clarify that. And now I have my first pull request to that repository just by adding documentation, and slowly but surely you kind of become an expert in some smaller capacity, and that is helpful as well.
That's lovely. In fact, internally at Neo4j today, we had a brown bag lunch about the documentation stuff. So it's a really nice coincidence. I think the documentation team here are super friendly. They're really quite good at engaging with the community. I think your experience isn't unique. It's lovely, but it's not unique. I think folks out there, if you are thinking you've got an itch to scratch, the documentation is often a really good place to start, right? If someone lodges kind of, in your mind, you think, that needs rephrasing or a bit more clarity or what have you, I think that's a great place to start, actually contributing even effectively directly into the Neo4j code base, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's very non-intimidating. So that's lovely. Cool. So let me ask a more speculative question. So you're effectively doing kind of civic-minded tech stuff. In your world, it seems to me, because they're human problems, and human problems seem to be quite graphy. Where do you think graphs might end up in this sector? Because it seems like there's the tyranny of choice, really.
Yes, there's many problems to tackle. Certainly. I think graphs in general, they don't go away. If things like Redis graph, and this week I stumbled over NPM repo that's called Gun.js, which is a graph database graph using loosely.
I'm very pleased to say there are loads of graph databases now, which is wonderful, because it means graph databases are a thing. It's not just Neo4j yelling about it. So that's a great outcome, I think.
Exactly, right. But I also believe that Neo4j as a leader in the graph space has a role in making the world a better place, right? So I really like those events like Graphs for Goods. And then, of course, the Panama Papers, they were phenomenal in making the rather complicated world of, financial injustice, I guess you could call it, make that really digestible if you put it in a graph. And my understanding is that essentially investigative journalists were working on this, maybe with some help from the folks at Neo4j, but to really highlight what is going on. And I obviously want more of that, not the injustices, but, bringing those things to surface. And so that's my hope, that people gather around what's important.
Well, I can give you some good news there, where the tech that underpins the ICIJ, the Neo4j stuff, is still there. We have a great relationship with those folks, and we absolutely support that kind of investigative journalism. Many of the folks in our community, many of the folks at Neo4j, we share that kind of sentiment that the world can be better. And we think that, by making sense of data, we can improve the quality of the world, and we can improve it for overwhelmingly the large majority of people on this planet by just making data useful. So I'm glad that you also share that sentiment. I guess it's a common sentiment amongst all of the people here at Nodes today. Matthias, thank you so much for spending some of your time with us here at Nodes today. I hope it's been a good conference for you. And thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much, Jim.
So I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce my final guest of the Nodes 2021 conference, my friend, Dr. Edgar Asuda, PhD from MIT, right, Edgar?
Yeah.
Which is actually, I feel a little bit anxious about this. I'm quite used to being the doctor. In fact, I used to have a Neo4j hoodie that said the doctor on the back. But I think MIT kind of beat Newcastle. So now, do you get to be the doctor? Is that how this works? I'm not sure. It's intimidating.
To be honest, I kind of normally downplay that. I don't have that in my LinkedIn line. I don't play with the titles that much. I think whatever you have learned in the past and you bring to the table is what really matters, not the actual titles. But thanks for that intro.
So let me dig at that a little, Dr. Asuna, while we're at it. So you've been doing operational research for a long time, which has led to where you are now as the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Todd Uno. But you started off, the first kind of LaTeX style academic paper of yours that I read was on support vector machines. Do you remember what they are?
I do. That's engraved in. Yeah, it was very fun for me to work on that in MIT when that technique was still crawling out of Bell Labs when Bell Labs represented what it did in the past in terms of technology. We're getting first drafts out of Vladimir Babnik, who's just an absolute genius and father of that technology, and I was thrilled to just be in the right spot at the right time and bring a small grain of sand into what then later was built as a mainstream technique.
That's marvelous. Humble as ever. So look, you since those days when you were a young student full of optimism and support vector machines, things have moved on. You are now Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Todd Uno. Now, I understand Chief Data and Analytics Officer. What's a Todd Uno? So
Todd Uno is a company that's been out there for over 20 years. Although people see us as technology, we don't see ourselves as technology company. We see ourselves as business partners of our banks. We service banks. And we use technology to get them derive business results, particularly, I would say, in two main areas: digital channels. So all their web and apps of this world run through us and are operated by us. And that, as you can imagine, has been a tremendous responsibility in this COVID era, but also in the security space, because it's coupled with that, right? You want to have customers that trust their channels, that trust their applications, that they know they're protected, and of course there are bad actors that try to take advantage of the distance that now they have with an app. In the old ages, they would have to come into a branch with holding a gun. Now they can do this from everywhere with a lot of more comfort. So we bring those two things into play, and we do it thinking of helping the banks achieve business results.
Okay, impressive. I mean, it certainly seems a lot more peaceful than robbing a bank at gunpoint. But I imagine also the kind of scale of, say, for example, fraudulent activity could be so much higher when you're doing it digitally rather than having to physically walk into a bank and hold up tellers at gunpoint. So how does that kind of evolve in your world?
Well, it evolves pretty rapidly because when you were doing it at gunpoint, and you missed or you failed, you were risking a lot of consequences. Now the fraudsters, they only have to get it right once. If they fail, they'll just continue, and that's unfortunately something that is part of the business here. And they evolve, and just as we have companies with whatever chief data officers and people working in analytics, I'm sure they have their own doing their research and investing in technology to do their whatever they do with a much higher level of sophistication. And it's particularly, I'd say, more dangerous because now payments are running into more of a real-time flavor. So payments, we want them to be faster. The industry, the customers are demanding that to be faster. and that obviously once the money leaves, then it's harder to stop. It's not as before where you would have more batch processing type of thing. So a lot of things are changing, and those are bringing challenges to us trying to protect.
That's interesting. It's fascinating to think somewhere there's an evil Edgar that's your counterpart who's trying to figure out how to defraud your system, and you're literally in an arms race with evil Edgar at this point. So tell us about how you came to graphs and the graph stuff that you're working on at Todo Uno.
Well, we were definitely trying to revamp our fraud detection and prevention system, and the first thing that popped up was, okay, so this is not a traditional database type of problem when you're looking at representing knowledge and representing and calculating features, particularly at real time. And if you think about it, when you go to a whiteboard and you start drawing a fraud pattern or fraudulent activity, you do that with nodes and arrows, which basically is a graph. So why would you try and do that with just tables if it's not the real paradigm for us to talk about, less to calculate stuff. So that's when we started, having been faithful users of traditional databases forever. How do we break that barrier and get into a different paradigm, just as doing that in graphs, particularly doing that for a real-time system?
Now, that's interesting, because earlier in the conversation with Julie Fisher, she said very much the same thing, right? For her, I was looking at spreadsheets and I kept being able to see through the data, I see through the matrix, as it were, and she could see the connections in the spreadsheets, and that led her to graphs. So it seems that you've had a similar kind of path where you've looked at patterns and figured out that that's hard to capture in a relational database, for example. And then tell me more about the real-time aspect, because, when I'm here in the UK and when I want to send a payment, our faster payment system is great. It will send money from one account to a neighboring account in just a matter of hours. But I think you're thinking about something a little bit like lower latency than that, right?
Yeah, and the payment systems in a lot of the banks that we service in LATAM are real-time payment systems. So once the transaction is clicked, the money is gone. So, and actually, I remember seeing that with a taxi driver that was actually explaining to me the payment system that he was using. Definitely, he was a believer in QR payment system, and he was thrilled to see, hey, look at this. You do this, and you see my account. Here's the money. So it was instantaneous, in that perspective. And obviously, that's a challenge, because from a user experience point of view, I don't even have the luxury of seconds to analyze your transaction. I have to do that in a sub-second time, so that all throughout the customer journey isn't affected. And although every transaction goes through our engine, people don't perceive that, and those don't get the delays that you would get if you have the luxury of spending 5-6 seconds to do that. Throughout all the journey has to take less than half a second.
So hang on, let me try and put this in perspective in my own mind here. You're saying that kind of a continental scale, I can do instantaneous payments that to a human really do feel like they're immediate. And yes, as part of that workflow, you're doing some rather sophisticated fraud checks.
Yes, and in those sophisticated checks, that's where you guys come in. All of the, let's say, all of the memory, all of the understanding, all of the, patterns, if you will, in history of behavior and the map and all the biometrics related to my end, bank customers, all of that is stored and continues to be stored real time, just as we speak, and is used to derive, whether that bank is going to challenge you with a one-time password, or let you go and get that transaction flowing, or deny that transaction because the confidence level is so high that definitely we do think that this is not Jim making the payment. So it has a profound impact on the customer satisfaction and therefore of those digital channels for those banks. And in this era, that is critical, particularly because if you think about it, you're one tweeted away from being, harassed to hell for bad service or bad timing or taking too long or denying too much or all of that. So it becomes a critical component for the banks in terms of their user interaction.
Wow, that's kind of brings it home, I think, rather scarily real that, even adding a second or two to a transaction suddenly becomes poor customer service.
Unacceptable. It would time out. Definitely, 2 seconds is a timeout automatically. So it has to happen, and it has to happen at a scale because if you think about it, 2 a.m. is not the same as noon or early afternoon. When people get the payrolls, obviously there's a lot more payments. When you are in certain holidays or Christmas, transactions go off the roof. So and that was part of one of the keys to our investment in Neo4j was to have something that was not just flexible in terms of being able to manage all of that, but also resilient so that if something goes wrong, because we are operating in a public cloud and things do go wrong every now and then, that happens, the show has to continue. And there's no excuse for us to get to the banks or the banks to their customers. And when we've had those issues, we've seen that Neo4j has performed perfectly well. Everything that we tested, that we thought from a theoretical point of view would work, things have worked, and the system has recovered later without impact on customer service.
Well, that's very good to hear. It's my ambition to make Neo4j boring. I think graphs are very exciting, but I think operating machinery should be as boring as possible. So, look, a lot of what we've discussed throughout this session has been very much from a community point of view. I realize that you're slightly different insofar as you're a commercial user of Neo4j. How's it been as a commercial user, kind of using kind of the Neo4j commercial side as interleaved with the stuff that you're working with the community and getting community help and all that stuff? How does that work for you?
Well, if you think about everything started, I would say pretty well from the way we got engaged, from a business perspective, right? The sales process was a process where customer satisfaction was first, second, and third, and only when we were satisfied, we started talking about, okay, so do we need to sign a contract? I think we need to pay for something. So it was the main concern from Dave and Alex was, what is it that you need? Let's understand what you need. Let's keep all this working, and then we talk about engaging that. I would say afterwards, you obviously need the product to perform, which has been the case as I mentioned before, and I think you also need that the aftermath is also handled very well on the technical side. These projects, they're never over. It seems they're always evolving, and that's where Rodrigo and Susan are bringing their expertise as well, and keep on tracking what we're doing, what are the resources that we need, and so on and so forth. And if I may mention something else that I think has been critical for us is being the participation from the folks from CMS. Because the reality is that Neo4j is a new technology, at least for us, it continues to be. And operating that, I sleep at night very sound because I know that the folks from CMS are, operating and managing, our cluster and all of our environments, including, QA and development. But, and I strongly, if I can recommend that to somebody, is if you really are operating something that is time sensitive, like it is in our use case, I would say, engaging and having the peace of mind of having people from CMS manage it works really well for everybody. So I think it's been I know it sounds corny, but it is a team effort, from the Alex and Dave of the world to the folks in CMS there's one company helping us have success with our customers.
That's a really gratifying thing to hear, Edgar. I think one of the things that makes me so happy about Neo4j is we have this wonderful community, many of whom are on this session, even this late in the day. But the people inside Neo4j, we're part of that community too, and it's full of really nice people. You mentioned Dave Richards and Alex Rivelis. I know those folks very well over in the US, and they are so community minded, right? It just so happens they're on the Neo4j payroll, but they are so minded to help. And then Susan and Rodrigo, similarly, they are there for you all the time, as if they were members of because they are members of the broader Neo4j community, and I love that. And
they're members of my team, when the customer feels, when the customer feels that they're members of your team, I think that's when success happens. We try to do that because we have customers on our own, right? We feel that the business partnerships that are built on trust, on mutual trust, are the ones that generate relationships that are lasting, right? Not just signing and fulfilling a quota, and that I don't think that cuts it.
That's wonderful to hear. I know that many of the folks on this conference, they won't necessarily have dealt with the commercial side of Neo4j. So I think it's really nice to hear from a real customer that the commercial side of Neo4j operates very similarly to the community side. It's full of people who really want to do well. That's pleasing, and I do hope that Dave, Alex, Susan, Rodrigo, and James are tuning in, because they're going to be absolutely pleased as punch that you've called them out. Let me zoom out in the final moments of our conversation. Edgar, we've known each other a while, and something you said before really stuck with me. And that's sort of quite counterintuitively that emerging economies like the global South have an advantage, a competitive advantage over those players in the global North. And that sounds very counterintuitive, but you've got a very compelling explanation for that around technology and levels of capital and so on. Would you mind expounding on that? I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, I'll give you two pointers into that, because I think it's a very deep discussion. And if you think about the software industry or some pieces of the technology space, they're not capital intensive. So there are areas where not so developed economies can actively participate, and the barriers are not as evident again for capital intensive type of activities. And you see some of these countries where education has been a big investment. The top talent that I have, for instance, for example, based out of Colombia, it's at par, if not superior, to other talents that I've seen in other areas in the world. And there's also a very high level of commitment to the result. They're not looking to move to the next, to the highest bidder after 6 months of working in a company. So you have certain conditions that are good for developing certain parts of industry. Cost for a lot of those resources is also significantly lower. So there are competitive advantages there to take advantage of. By the way, I think Silicon Valley is starting to take note of that, because we've seen some of these markets, heating up, but it happens that way. And the other thing that is a characteristic of some of these spaces is that, for instance, if you talk about the payment industry, which we were talking about just a while ago, customers are used to something that is real time. They're not going to take batch payment, NAFTA style or NACHA style or Fed style, where there are 3 or 4 windows during the day. Like, why? We're already used to real time payment systems. So it's that keeps those resources thinking in an advanced setting. And then when you reach markets like the U.S. market, for instance, I would say in some areas we're well ahead in the curve.
That makes so much sense. I guess in a way you're able to completely skip the mainframe era, the relational era, and you're able to pick modern technology tools that can really propel a business forward, I think, as you folks have.
Yeah, and I think in our case, it's being key. And I joined Todo Uno only 2 years ago, but it's, as I said before, this company has been going for over 20. All C-level have been doing banking for over 20 years. And that means, again, it's not a technology company in the sense that we're not selling bits and bytes. We understand how a bank works on the inside, not only on the technology front, but on the business front. And I think those use cases are the ones that can add value to our customers.
That's wonderful. Look, Edgar, I have to say, look, thank you so much for taking time out of your day today. I know that you're due to go on vacation soon, so I really appreciate you, especially taking time out to spend with us. It's been wonderful hosting you. Thank you so much. A pleasure
talking with you, Jim, and hope to see you physically at some point, I don't know, hopefully before the end of the year.
I hope so. I still owe you that cold beer that I promised many moons ago. I will make good on it.
It's
a pity I can't do a faster beer payment. Thank you very much, Edgar.
Thank you for having me.